The notification came at 4:15 a.m., suddenly, soundlessly, like a blow to the chest, and the soft blue light of the screen spilled over my face in the darkness of our bedroom, the one that now belonged only to me, although once it seemed to be shared, filled with the breath of two, and not the dull silence of loneliness. Pulsating in the void, where his voice no longer sounds and his footsteps do not rustle on the floor. Without opening my eyes, I allowed myself to stay in the half-doze where my consciousness was still holding on to an illusion, a faint hope that maybe it was just a banking error, an automatic notification that had no reality, could not hurt, could not destroy, but soon the screen went dark, and the dream succumbed. He returned, not for long, heavy, viscous, filled with expectation. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. I woke up again a little later, when the morning gloom began to recede before the gray dawn slowly penetrating through the translucent curtains, and the first thing I did was feel my phone on the bedside table, the screen of which, blinking blindly, reminded me again of what I was trying to avoid. The message from UniCredit is clear and indisputable. Confirmation of purchase addressed to David, 2 business class tickets to Paris departing next Friday, date, time, amount, everything is verified as a verdict. 2 tickets. Not alone, as if he was going on a business trip. Not 3, not with a child, not with a family. 2. And I knew that the second one wasn't for me. That was never the case for me. I remember how at that moment everything seemed to go dark, as if the air had become heavier, as if the ceiling was pressing on my chest, and my throat was so tight that it became difficult to breathe, and tears, hot and scorched, gathered on my eyelashes before they could spill. My thumb was trembling, hovering over the notification, barely touching the screen, and for a moment I seriously wanted to delete everything, not read it, forget it, but 15 years of marriage, 15 years of living together, with its ups, downs, silences, hugs, arguments and reconciliations, taught me to feel things that are not spoken out loud. To distinguish shadows in the voice, tricks in gestures, sudden flashes in the eyes, and I knew it wasn't an accident. He didn't talk about the trip, he didn't mention it once, not 3 days ago, when he was so extraordinarily gentle and attentive at dinner, he didn't say much, but he held my hand a little longer than usual, nor yesterday morning, when he habitually kissed my temple and said it would be late, another delay, another job, something important again, something urgent. And now these are the tickets. Paris. Our Paris. Where we were happy. I sat down on the bed, the biggest one in which we once laughed so much, fell asleep, argued and reconciled, the one we had chosen together in an infinitely distant, naive time, and wrapped myself in a warm blanket as a shield, as the only protection from the blows that were yet to come. The house was too quiet, and even the familiar hum of the refrigerator downstairs seemed like a strange sound, somehow new, heightened, as if now even the technology knew everything had changed. A fine autumn rain began to drizzle outside, and the drops hitting the windowsill created a rhythm as steady as a countdown counter. Paris, I whispered to myself, and the word felt like poison seeping under my skin. That's where he's taking her. It was there where we were different, where he promised me eternity, where I believed that we would always be together. I remembered that little cafe on the corner, which smelled of croissants and coffee, where he looked at me with such tenderness, as if he saw his reflection, and where he said, "You are my destiny." And now he might take her there, say the same words to her. She'll laugh, just like I used to. And he will hug her like he used to hug me. I opened my laptop, my breathing was labored, my heart was beating heavily, as if someone was beating inside my chest trying to get out, and I entered the password for our shared account. The cold, ruthless digital truth appeared before me, the route, the amount, the names. David. Albina. Albina, his marketer, the one who came to dinner with us a month ago, smiled, talked about tenders, presentations, laughed at David's jokes, looked at me like a friend, and perhaps her foot touched his under the table, played, tasted, owned. My chest was filled with pain, but my hands weren't shaking. Something new was born in me at that moment. Ice. Solid, clean, dangerous. I went to the bathroom, turned on the light, and stared at my reflection for a long time. Woman. Not young, not old, just a woman, tired but not broken. Wrinkles around the eyes, tarnished hair, carelessly gathered, When did I stop being myself? When did he stop seeing me as the one he loved? But something in his gaze had changed. Determination. I won't scream. I won't cry. I will not humiliate myself. I picked up my phone and took a screenshot of the tickets, carefully, with cold precision, like evidence in a case where the truth is more important than emotions. Then I logged into my old mailbox, which David had long forgotten existed, and forwarded this letter to myself. Proof. That night, I did not call him to ask where he was, did not write messages, did not break the silence, which for the first time in a long time felt like an ally, not an enemy, as if confirming to myself that silence can be louder than any words, if there is not impotence, but determination behind it. I just brewed myself a cup of strong black tea, adding a slice of lemon to it, as I did in those days when I still believed that caring could save love, and sat down at the kitchen island, staring into the darkness outside the window, where the city was beginning to blossom, unaware of either my loneliness or my betrayal, and she began to think, ponder, plan, build something inside herself that with every passing moment took on clear contours, like a blueprint for revenge, carefully drawn in a heart tired of pain. I recalled our story like a man reviewing a film in reverse order, and with each frame in this mental film, I saw more and more clearly how his touches gradually disappeared, how our conversations thinned out, how love, once pulsating in every glance, in every gesture, became something conventional, familiar, almost decorative. I remembered how his business trips became more frequent and longer, how his eyes slipped away from mine when he hurriedly turned off the phone or went into another room to answer a call, how someone else's scent appeared on the collar of his shirt, not mine, not ours, and maybe not hers, but anyway a stranger. All these were details, little things that accumulated over the years like sediment at the bottom of a glass, until they turned into a sticky, bitter realization. He left me even before he dared to leave physically. But that night I was thinking not only about myself, but also about our daughter, Laura, who went to college, believed in honesty, in ideals, in her father, whom she adored to tears and to whom she wrote every Saturday, sharing her joys and fears. How diligently he built an image of a caring, strong, reliable, exemplary man, a man who could be trusted, for whom one could be proud, and how at the same time he methodically destroyed everything that he himself called to believe in. By morning, when the first rays of the sun began to slowly spread across the marble surface of the kitchen countertops, I already knew exactly what to do. I no longer felt rage, it burned overnight like paper on fire. All that remains is crystal clarity, the one that comes when nothing can be denied anymore, when every lie is revealed, every self-deception is exposed, and there is no longer the strength to live in an illusion. When David came into the house in the early morning, looking tired, as if he had just left a meeting, and muttered, "Sorry, I fell asleep right in the office," I smiled, kissed him on the cheek, and said softly, "You're working too hard," pushing a cup of freshly brewed coffee towards him, the aroma of which filled the kitchen, mixing with the smell of rain still hanging in the air. He looked surprised and grateful, almost touched, like a man who expected reproaches, but got an understanding, and had no idea that while he was taking a shower, I had already talked to my travel agent, named the right dates, names, and selected seat 3C on the very flight that was supposed to take them to Paris. My Paris is right next to 3B, where he will be, and 3A is her place, by the window, perhaps with a view of the clouds, which she will look at in love while I watch them both. The week left before their departure became for me something between an absurd play and a thriller, where I was both an actress, director, and audience at the same time. Every morning I woke up next to David, cooked breakfast for him, asked about his plans for the day, smiled, saw him off, and all the time I was saying only one thing: "You're a liar." Every night he told me about negotiations, meetings, documents, and I listened, nodded, and inserted encouraging phrases, as if everything was as before, but inside me there was a voice monotonously repeating, "Liar, liar, liar." On Tuesday, he announced that he urgently had to fly to Chicago, supposedly an important client, a critically important deal, and he even had the audacity to say, "You know how much I hate being apart for so long." He packed his suitcase with special attention, selecting ties, including the blue silk one that I gave him last Christmas as a symbol of care, love, and devotion. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, handed him my travel makeup bag and said, "I understand. Business is business," and at that moment I felt something inevitable happening inside me, as if the old me was slowly leaving the stage. After he left, I opened a bottle of wine and dialed my sister, Sophia, the first person I dared to say anything to. I wasn't going to share it. If I said it out loud, it would become real, it would materialize, and I couldn't dismiss it, but I couldn't stay silent anymore. "He's taking her to Paris," I whispered when the second glass was empty. Sophia was silent for a long time, and I already thought that the connection was broken before she exhaled, "Patricia. Are you sure?" I laughed, dryly, hollowly, joylessly. I saw the tickets. Their names. Hotel. Glamorous. Luxury. Our room. There was a silence filled with anger and bitterness. "That's a scoundrel," she whispered. "What are you going to do? Resist?" "No," I said. "Better. I'll tell you what I've come up with." When I finished, Sophia was shocked. "It's crazy. But it's brilliant." "Are you sure? Are you sure?" No, I wasn't sure about anything else. Not about marriage, not about myself, not about what would happen next. But I knew one thing for sure. I deserved to know the whole truth. And I deserved to take my life back, on my own terms. "I'm sure," I said to Sophia, and for the first time in weeks, there was not a shadow of doubt in my voice, not a drop of confusion, just a calm, measured determination, like a person who finally allowed himself to see things as they are, without embellishment, without illusions, without trying to shield the other at the expense of himself. I needed to see it with my own eyes, not because I doubted the facts, not because I wanted to hear a confession, but because I needed them, David and Albina, to see me the way I see them, at a moment when they would be sure of their impunity, when their faces will be relaxed when they think that everything is under control. And that's when I will appear, not with hysteria, not with reproaches, but with silence, in which a ringing echo of my dignity will be heard. The next morning, I immediately went to the bank and withdrew $15,000 from our joint savings account, an amount large enough to give me freedom of action, but not enough to arouse suspicion from David, who had long since stopped following the details of our lives, thinking that everything important was under his control. Control. I opened a new account in my own name, feeling a strange mixture of anxiety and liberation, as if this act was not just a financial step, but a symbolic break in the web of addiction that I had unknowingly become entangled in over the years of marriage. Then I contacted a lawyer from a low-profile but reliable firm on the other side of town, which David did not know existed, and signed up for a consultation, not to file for divorce, but to understand where my rights are, what resources are available to me, what steps are possible if the game goes on. The receptionist, a polite woman with soft eyes, asked me about the purpose of the visit, and I answered with a slight smile, "I'm exploring my options," and there was more truth in those words than she could have guessed. That evening, I stood at the open closet, looking at the hangers with clothes, like a general before a battle choosing a uniform, not just things, but symbols, armor, signs of power. I took out the very dress, black, with a perfect fit, that David had bought for our anniversary. Then it seemed like a gift of love. Now it will be a reminder that I was desired. I put a cashmere sweater in my suitcase, which accentuated the green color of my eyes, and high-heeled shoes, in which I always felt taller, not only in height, but also in spirit. On Wednesday, David called from Chicago. His voice sounded calm and confident as always, and when he said, "It's cold in here." A typical Chicago winter, I nodded, as if he were standing in front of me, and glancing at the weather app on my phone, I saw that it was plus 52 degrees in Chicago, sunny, unusually warm for February. "It's a pity," I replied, trying to keep my voice warm. "Stay warm." He said he missed me, said it in a tone that once made my heart tremble, but now sounded like an empty chord repeated too many times. I held back the words that were already on my tongue, and instead said softly, "I miss too." Then she added, casually, "I'm thinking of visiting Laura this weekend. To surprise her. Since you're away." "That's a great idea," he said with relief, as if he had received another confirmation that everything was still under control. He knew I wouldn't try to call if I was with my daughter. A perfect alibi, built for two people. On Thursday evening, I methodically packed my suitcase, carefully folding clothes, toiletries, documents, and, separately from everything else, a small thing that I ordered through Sophia, an elegant, nondescript pen that hid a high-resolution camera. "Just in case," she said as she handed it to me, and I realized that even she, always pragmatic, sees the point. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, pictures popped up in front of me. David and Albina on a walk under the Eiffel Tower, laughing, in love, careless in their confidence, her head on his shoulder, their bodies entwined in a hotel bed, paid for with our money, our history, our lives. I remembered how we saved with him, how I counted every penny when he first started the business, how I refused new things so that he could invest a little more in the project, how I worked nights to cover the costs, and how all this was supposed to be our pension, our protection, our investments in the future, in the house, in Laura's wedding. And now it's all about another woman, another life built on my dedication. I gave them everything, I whispered into the darkness of the bedroom. And they are simple. They threw me away. Like an empty package after a holiday, like something that has fulfilled its function. Friday morning was cold and clear, the sky cloudless, as if the world knew that something important was about to begin today. I called an Uber and arrived at the airport 3 hours before departure to be the first at the gate to quietly take my seat, 3C, before they boarded. I had to control the moment of the meeting. I had to be ready. Registration was quick. The airline agent, a smiling girl in her mid-20s, looked at my ticket and said cheerfully, "Paris." How romantic. "Yes," I replied, and smiled back at her. "I'm meeting someone there." And it was the truth, in a perverse, frightening, ironic way. I've never felt so precise, so calculating, so alive. I've never been able to play chess, David tried to teach me, saying that the point is not in the pieces, but in strategy, in the ability to calculate a few steps ahead, predict the opponent's move, hide a real blow under fake maneuvers. "The most beautiful thing in chess," he said, "is when the enemy realizes defeat only when it's too late." My preparations began a few months before I found out about Paris. I felt that something was wrong, but I couldn't name it for sure. It was rather a feeling like a light draft in a room without open windows, a rustle behind the wall when the house seemed empty. Call it intuition, feminine instinct, self-preservation, whatever you want, but deep down even then, I knew that my life with David, as I knew it, was coming to an end. I began collecting information, not with the greed of a spy, but with the sad determination of a woman who can no longer afford to trust without proof. Digital footprints, light as breadcrumbs that someone else would have missed, became evidence for me, fleeting evidence that I could not afford to ignore. Last summer, when David, hurriedly leaving home for another business trip, left his laptop open, I almost without hesitation installed monitoring software that directs his incoming emails to a secret mailbox that I created back in the years of our collaboration, not for surveillance. At least that's how I felt then. She was trying to calm us down, but to protect us if my premonitions turned out to be true. I didn't touch on this correspondence for months, not daring to open the gateway, which could hide the abyss. I allowed information to accumulate, as if postponing the moment when I would have to admit that my intuition was not wrong, but, on the contrary, patiently waited for me to catch up with my own truth. And now, sitting in the waiting room at gate C-17, watching passengers rushing past, preoccupied with their routes, I finally plucked up the courage and opened this mailbox. What I saw left no room for doubt. Hundreds of letters, photographs, fragments of late-night conversations, affectionate nicknames, travel plans, and repeated mentions of Paris, hidden between the lines as a promise of a new life in which there was no room for me, or even memories. But the most painful thing was not the betrayal as such, not his correspondence with her, not the intimate photos that made my throat constrict. But the hardest part was the realization that David had been playing a double game with amazing calculation all this time. He transferred funds from our joint business account to a separate one, gradually, starting with paltry amounts that could easily get lost in accounting, and then, emboldened, I increased my pace, as if testing the limit of my blindness. He was creating a safety cushion for himself, building a path to a life without me, a life in which he would leave me with nothing. But he didn't know that 2 weeks ago I had already met with Gaspard, our old accountant, a man whom we had trusted since the days when we ran the business from the garage, a man whose daughter I supported during her school years, helping her with her studies, editing her essays, giving a recommendation to college. Gaspard, seeing the documents I brought, shook his head and, lowering his voice, said, "This is not just unethical, Patricia. This is already bordering on criminal liability, especially the transfer of funds that belong to clients. He has already prepared a detailed report for my lawyer." David always considered me a woman who was great for social gatherings, a good mother, but far from finances. He forgot that under the layer of everyday worries I have an MBA degree, which I postponed in order to be with him and Laura, to build a home, not a career. I looked at my watch. There was 1 hour left before boarding. I took out my phone, opened my mail, and sent 3 emails that were pre-programmed to be delivered automatically in a day if I didn't stop them. The first is to the board of directors of our company, with an attached financial report. The second was to Laura. There were no accusations in it, only a gentle, sincere explanation that would help her understand what was going on. And the third was to David's parents, to whom I was still grateful for the way they had received me once, a letter full of regret, but not bitterness, with a farewell that did not contain malice. I didn't want revenge. I wanted the truth to do its job. After that, I dialed Detective Columbo's number, not the one in the series, but my university classmate, now a specialist in financial investigations. We talked with him a week ago. He listened to me carefully and said that there was enough evidence to start an investigation. "Everything is ready," he said then. "Just send the message when you're ready, and we'll get started." I dialed his number again today. "I'm ready," I said softly. "Thank you, Columbo." 15 years of friendship is something unusual, he replied. "Besides, what he's doing is a textbook on cheating. We would have caught him anyway." I thanked him again and ended the conversation. Opening the compact mirror, I appreciated my reflection. Yesterday's visit to the salon was not just a whim. New haircut, soft shine of hair, fresh color. The woman who looked at me from the mirror was no longer someone David could leave in the shadows. She was ready for her party. I took out a lipstick, Chanel Rouge Allure, pirate shade, bright red, bold, defiant, the one that David once called too bright for me. Today, he was spot on. My phone vibrated as I received a message from Sophia. "Has the plane landed yet?" In a short, businesslike way, as she always wrote when there was real concern behind her words. "Not yet," I replied, looking at the gradually filling cabin, where multilingual passengers were settling into their seats with that fussy impatience that always accompanies the beginning of a journey. "Boarding is coming soon." "I'm ready." The answer came almost instantly. "Remember, you're not just doing this for yourself. You do this for every woman who has ever felt invisible." I smiled, covering the phone screen with my palm, as if I wanted to hide from outsiders the fire that had flared up in my chest. Sophia is my eternal feminist, unapologetic, sarcastic, fearless. She was not mistaken. It was more than just exposing the deception, more than just an act of revenge or even an act of liberation. It was a statement: I am here again, I speak again, I exist again. An employee at the boarding gate announced the end of boarding and asked to fasten their seatbelts. I checked to make sure everything was in place, making sure that there was still a thick sealed envelope in my carry-on bag. It contained the documents that my lawyer had been working on without sleep for 3 nights, official divorce papers, account statements confirming David's machinations, Gaspard's testimony, expert certificates. Each the sheet is neatly numbered and filed. Everything was ready for the presentation at an altitude of 35,000 feet. Symbolic, isn't it? I even packed him a bottle of whiskey, Glendronach, his favorite single malt, which he drank exclusively on flights, saying that it helps him cope with anxiety before takeoff. He thought I hadn't noticed his panicked looks during the turbulence or how he clutched the armrest convulsively as the plane came in for landing. I knew it. I always knew. I knew everything he thought I couldn't understand. And so, moving to my place, I saw them. David and Albina were standing at the exit. He hugged her. His palm rested on her lower back with such natural tenderness that something broke inside me. She laughed, leaning over him, and he lowered his head and whispered something in her ear. He hadn't looked at me like that in years, not with admiration, not with warmth, not with desire. Their eyes were glued to each other. They were blinded by their own passion, like children playing hide and seek, not realizing what they had found a long time ago. I boarded earlier, choosing a seat in advance, 3C, Business class, left row. She carefully laid out her things, making sure that the pen with the built-in camera fit comfortably in the breast pocket of her jacket, and, ordering a glass of champagne, leaned against the headrest, allowing herself to close her eyes for a moment. Are you celebrating something special? What is it? The flight attendant asked with a friendly, almost maternal smile, and I took a sip and felt the bubbles sizzle vividly on my tongue. You could say that, I replied. Today is the first day of my remaining life. She nodded politely, not realizing how literal it was. I watched the entrance with bated breath, and finally, at the moment of the last announcement, they boarded. David led Albina to their seats in the third row, still touching her with that casual possessive affection with which he had once touched me. He would lean over and whisper something, and her laughter could be heard all over the aisle, the same light, musical laugh that I had already heard when she first tasted my fried chicken at our dining table and praised it with excessive admiration. Only now there was an unmistakable intimacy in that laugh. I took a deep breath, allowed my lips to curve into a faint half-smile, and raised my glass, partially obscuring my face as they passed by. David, without looking, checked the seat numbers, and, stopping next to him, said, "Here we are. You take the window." Albina sank into an armchair, adjusting her designer bag under the seat. I recognized her. That's exactly what I once showed David on the pages of a magazine, and then he grinned, ridiculous. Paying that kind of money for leather and a logo? And now she was lying at her feet. He turned to take his seat, he thought, and suddenly froze, looking right at me. I lowered my glass and looked into his eyes. "Hi, David," I said with cold politeness, as if we had met by chance at a conference. He turned pale. The color drained from his face so fast that I seriously thought he might pass out right there in the aisle. His lips opened, then closed, then opened again. 15 years of living together, and I'd never seen him lost, stunned, unable to find words before. "Patricia. What is it?" He finally managed. His voice was so thin that I barely heard him. "Who are you? How are you?" He started, but I calmly held out my boarding pass in front of me. "Location 3C, I said, pointing at the numbers. "Next to you." What a coincidence. Albina leaned forward, her face, which had been flushed with carefree laughter a moment ago, suddenly froze in uncertainty, which deepened into anxious confusion with each passing second, until her gaze met mine. There was a moment of recognition, heavy as a thunderclap in a clear sky, followed immediately by undisguised panic, which made her straighten up abruptly and instinctively turn to David, as if seeking protection in him, an explanation, confirmation that what was happening was not a nightmare, but a ridiculous misunderstanding that he was about to correct. "You need to get off the plane," he hissed at me, his voice, usually so confident and resonant, now trembled. There was desperation in it, an attempt to maintain at least a shadow of control. "We can talk about it when I get back. This is not the place." "Please take your seat, sir," the flight attendant intervened, standing slightly behind him, professionally polite, but with increasing impatience, as preparations for departure required her attention. David hesitated for only a second, then sat down, his movements mechanical, as if he no longer controlled his body, and only a thin perspiration stood out on his forehead, betraying the tension that permeated him to the bones, despite the cool air of the cabin. "Patricia," he said, leaning toward me and lowering his voice to a tense whisper, in which there was no longer any threatening severity or condescending sarcasm, only concern. "Let me explain. It's not what it seems." I tilted my head slightly, as if surprised by his naivety. "Isn't that why you're going to take your marketing consultant to Paris for the weekend coinciding with our 15th anniversary, to the very hotel where we spent our honeymoon, and if I see correctly from bank transactions, paying for the room from our shared account?" Albina, clasping her hands in her lap, made a strangled, almost plaintive sound, as if trying to say something in her own defense, but the words did not form into sentences. A flight attendant came up with a tray of drinks, addressing them. "Champagne for the gentleman and lady at the window?" "Yes," I replied before David could say anything. "My husband and his colleague will be happy to have champagne. After all, we're celebrating." David shot me a warning look, but his hand, which was reaching for the glass, was trembling treacherously, betraying his inner turmoil. The flight attendant left, and a tense silence filled with the untold reigned between us again. "What do you want?" David asked, his voice rough and strained, with a hint of panic mixed with anger and growing confusion. "Money? Is that why you're here? To humiliate me?" I laughed, softly but sincerely, amazed at his inability to understand the essence of what was happening. "David, if I needed money, I would just transfer it from our accounts. Like you've been doing for the last 18 months. His face turned abruptly white, and I could almost feel his heart beating faster. "What are you talking about? An offshore account?" He choked out, not believing, not wanting to believe. "I'm talking about the creative accounting in your company. About customer payments that were suddenly delayed. Did you really think Gaspard wouldn't notice? He has been loyal to us for 12 years. Have you talked to Gaspard?" His voice was now almost indistinguishable over the increasing hum of the engines. "I spoke," I confirmed, calmly taking another sip of champagne, "with Detective Columbo, and with the board of directors of your firm, and with ours, or rather, my lawyer now." I reached into my bag, taking my time, and found a sealed envelope, which I placed on his lap with delicate solemnity. "Happy anniversary, dear. 15 years is traditionally a crystal wedding, but it seems to me that in these circumstances legal documents are more suitable." He stared at the envelope as if afraid to touch it. Albina froze, staring at me intently, her glass untouched. "You're bluffing," he finally said, but even to himself, the words seemed empty. I took out my phone, opened my email and turned the screen to him. The title of the letter, "Prepared for automatic dispatch in 24 hours, was large and unambiguous. "These are copies of letters for council members, clients, and family. Everything is documented, with attachments and signatures. If I don't cancel the shipment, everyone will know everything in a day. You see, David," I leaned forward, and my voice became almost affectionate, "while you were planning an escape to Paris with a pretty assistant, I was also making a plan. The difference is that it's not just our marriage that's destroying mine. If you don't cooperate, everything you've built will collapse." The seatbelt signal came on in the cabin, and a soft chime signaled the start of taxi driving. I buckled my seatbelt, and with a slight, expectant movement of my head, I looked at him until he finally obeyed and buckled in. "What do you want? What is it?" he repeated, but there was no rage in his voice now, just a quiet, barely audible defeat. I leaned closer so that Albina could hear too. "I want everything I'm legally entitled to, plus compensation for the damage done to my reputation, which you've sunk by dragging me into your schemes. I want a house. I want half of all business assets, legal ones. And full transparency on all accounts." "This is ridiculous," he muttered, still not taking his eyes off the envelope, as if he was trying to turn it into something less frightening than it really was. "This is more than any court would require." "We're not going to court," I interrupted softly, crossing my legs and leaning back in my chair, allowing myself a moment of confident calm, which I knew he lacked so much. "The trial would be dirty, protracted, public, and, worst of all for you, David, it would lead to potential criminal charges, which means not only loss of reputation, but also the real prospect of being behind bars, and not in a figurative sense. It will remain confidential until you sign it. Today. Here. On this plane." The plane began to taxi to the runway, and David, as if waking up from a daze, clutched the armrests with such force that his knuckles turned white. He was always nervous before takeoff, afraid that the metal would not hold up, that the engine would stall, that the altitude would not forgive his weakness. "There's a pen in the envelope," I added, almost with a caring intonation, as if I were reminding a forgetful student of the necessary tool for passing an important exam. Albina, who had been deathly silent until now, finally spoke. Her voice was thin, broken, and there was a hint of fright behind which there was confusion. "David, what does she say about the criminal charges? Didn't you tell me that everything with the money was legal?" I turned to her with sincere sympathy, which came from an unexpected realization. She was a pawn, just like I used to be, only I hadn't realized yet how thoroughly she'd been used. "Albina," I said softly, Did you really think that you were the only one he was lying to? Meanwhile, David was fiddling with the envelope, as if hoping that slowness could delay the inevitable. The plane was picking up speed, and he, still not fully believing in what was happening, finally printed it out. Inside are neatly folded divorce papers signed by my lawyer, financial agreements carefully verified by lawyers, and a letter of resignation from the company's board, drawn up in strict accordance with the Articles of Association and corporate procedures. I watched as we lifted off the ground, and with this rise, so mechanically precise and physically undeniable, came another realization: 15 years of marriage, filled with illusions, compromises, betrayals, and the struggle for the appearance of love, slowly and inexorably left my horizon, rushing down to the point where it all began. David read the documents, and from time to time he shook his head, as if he refused to admit that the text written on paper was not fiction, but the truth, cold-blooded and precise as a scalpel. "There's a notary in business class," I said casually, C8D. "I met her at the check-in. She agreed to witness your signature during the flight." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with despair, anger, and amazement at the scale of the carefully planned operation. "You've thought of everything," he said bitterly. "I've studied with the best," I replied, allowing myself a small smile. "You always told me to think 10 steps ahead." By the time we reached cruising altitude, David, whose jaw was clenching with such force that it seemed his teeth were about to snap, nevertheless signed each document with a black capillary pen, which I carefully put in the envelope, the same pen in which the built-in dictaphone captured every word, every gesture, every breath of defeat. When the fastened seatbelt sign went out, I called the notary, and in the enclosed space of the salon, where there were no doors to exit or corners to hide, the notary approached with the calmness of a professional, checked the documents, authenticated the signatures, and put an official seal, which was sealed at the end. "I'll get some scotch," he said softly as the flight attendant passed by. "Make a double." I gathered up the papers, folded them neatly, and, like an expensive watch, put them in a leather folder, which I put back in my bag. "You can keep the trip to Paris," I said without any irony. "Consider it a parting gift. I've booked a return flight for tomorrow." "How generous," he said sarcastically, but I didn't react anymore. Words didn't have the same power over me as before. "If I were you, I wouldn't make any purchases using the company's card. These accounts have already been frozen." The color drained rapidly from Albina's face, like a puppet suddenly left without a thread. "What about our hotel? Reservations?" I smiled, not unkindly this time. "I'm sure David has enough money for more modest housing. Perhaps with separate beds. Now you know who he really is." A year has passed. 12 months since the flight BA 2296 to Paris, where, at an altitude of 35,000 feet, I regained not just freedom, but a whole life. Now I'm sitting in a cafe on the terrace of the 7th Arrondi shopping center, watching the streams of tourists slowly moving towards the Eiffel Tower, shrouded in a light mist of the coming evening. Paris in February has a special, melancholic beauty, not flashy, not pretentious, but deep, almost restrained. Bare trees, the sky the color of old silver, pale stone buildings softly illuminated by lanterns. Everything here breathes balance, and every breath feels like a new beginning. I ordered a glass of Bordeaux and a small plate of cheese, taking my time, savoring every bite. Paris feels different when you're no longer running away from anyone or trying to hold anyone back. After this flight, events developed rapidly, as if the previously slow-motion reality suddenly became sharper, filled with sound and movement, like a movie running at normal speed after a long freeze frame. The evidence I collected, emails, transactions, recordings of conversations, a carefully constructed chronology of events and indisputable facts, did not leave David the slightest chance to dispute anything or try to transfer the blame to others. His partners, having found out about everything, bought out his shares from the company, and they did it for a tiny fraction of their actual value, more to get rid of a toxic figure in the leadership than to extract immediate benefits. And even this step, in fact, a delicate business execution, was dictated not by righteous anger, but by respect for me, for my self-control, for the years I devoted to the company, for all those inconspicuous efforts that helped the business survive the most difficult times. I kept the house for myself, by court order and by unspoken agreement with David, but 6 months later I sold it. There were too many ghosts in his walls, not the ones that scare at night, but the ones that whisper during the day, when every room has an echo of something that never really happened: reciprocity, trust, love without calculation. The marble floors remembered the steps of a woman trying to be perfect, the wooden staircase creaked with habits that had become a cage, and the windows reflected more pain than light. I didn't want to live among the ruins of illusions anymore. Laura, my daughter, didn't talk to me for 2 months after I told her everything. She idolized her father, and for her, the truth was a betrayal, not only of his, but also of mine, because I had allowed this lie to exist for so long. I didn't blame her. Her silence was her way of mourning the ruined family picture, and I waited patiently. Eventually, one rainy Sunday evening, when the gray sky looked so much like her depressed face, she showed up at my new apartment with a bottle of cheap wine and eyes full of tears. "I've read the emails," she said, sitting down next to me and handing me a glass. "Dad left the computer on when I arrived. I saw everything." We cried together that night, without hysteria, without loud words, just the two of us, mother and daughter, on the verge between the past and a new beginning, mourning not only the end of marriage, but also the collapse of her childhood faith in her father. The healing between us was slow, like the healing process after a deep wound, but sincere, honest, and therefore real. She is here in Paris with me now, although at that moment she left to explore Montmartre with friends from her training program. As for David and Albina, their romance, as expected, did not even survive the flight. She left him right at the airport, in the baggage claim area, having learned not only about the true extent of his deception, but also about how easily he was ready to use her as a tool for his own salvation. David returned to life, completely changed, without his previous career, with a fragmented family and a tarnished reputation. The last I heard, he moved to Arizona, where he works for a small accounting firm owned by a distant relative, trying to piece together something like a new stability. Sometimes, especially in the silence of late evenings, I wondered if I had been too harsh, too cold-blooded in my revenge. Had I crossed the line beyond which justice ends and vengeance begins? But then I remembered the ruthless clarity with which he built his exit: lies, substitution, gaslighting, the years in which he convinced me that I was not so smart, not so good, not so worthy to exist on a par with him. I remembered how he wanted to leave me without financial support, vulnerable, in the shadows, while he was starting a new life with a young woman. No, I don't regret my actions. I only regret the years I spent dimming my lights to make them shine brighter. My phone vibrated on the table, distracting me from my thoughts. A message from Sophia, my colleague in a new case. The first anniversary of Operation Capture of Paris. What is the view from the other side? I smile, raise a glass of wine, photograph it against the background of a Parisian street, where the evening begins to hide the stones in a velvety mist, and send back, clean and bright. The waiter comes over and fills my glass, asking with polite interest, "Would you like something else, madam?" I think for a moment, taking his simple question with unexpected depth. What do I want? What do I want now, after 15 years of striving for what seemed to be the ideal: to be a good wife, to please, to deserve attention, to be sufficient? The answer comes like a flash of light in a misty valley: I want this moment. The quiet joy of being yourself, not explaining yourself, not holding back, building a life on your own terms. I started a consulting business that helps women gain financial independence after a divorce. It turns out that my experience, no matter how painful, is valuable for those who follow the same path. There's something surprisingly healing about turning a personal injury into a professional goal. Laura returns as the sky darkens and the Eiffel Tower begins its sparkling dance. She looks more like me than ever, the same determined chin, the same confident look, which shows not age, but maturity already experienced. She sits down opposite me, her cheeks flushed from the cold wind. "How was your day?" I ask, pushing a plate of cheese towards her. "It's amazing," she says, and there's a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I'm thinking of applying for a master's degree here in France." We're talking about the future, her future, full of unknowns, but no longer frightening, but inviting. And suddenly I realize, my biggest victory was not in how flawlessly I executed my plan, or in the financial settlement, But in what I showed my daughter, humiliation cannot be considered the norm, betrayal cannot be forgiven in silence, and the bravest act is not always a struggle. Sometimes it is withdrawal, or, as in my case, standing firmly next to the truth. Later, on the way back to the hotel, she takes my arm. "Mom," he says softly, "I'm proud of you. For surviving. For being real." I squeeze her hand, unable to find the words, but I feel the lights of Paris reflected in the puddles, turning into stars under our feet. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.